Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to our webinar on the adoption of the CSDDD and what does this mean for Swiss companies. This webinar is organized jointly by the Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein and Focusright. My name is Alice Harbach-Borrell, and I'm the head of the programs at the UN Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein. We are the local chapter of the UN Global Compact initiative that counts more than 20,000 business participants worldwide at the moment. The goal of the UN Global Compact is to make companies aware of the relevance of social, environmental, and governance issues to their core business and to support them in implementing good practices along the 10 principles. Through diverse learning and dialogue formats, such as today's webinar, we promote dialogue exchange and knowledge sharing. In May this year, the EU Council adopted the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, also known as CSDDD or CSDDD, and therefore introduce new obligations for companies regarding adverse impact on human rights and the environment. Through the directive, the EU levels the playing field for the sustainability due diligence of large companies, which will affect their business partners along the value chain. This new EU directive is part of a global trend towards more stringent due diligence rules for companies. Worldwide, the legal environment in the field of responsible business conduct is evolving at an unprecedented speed, putting pressure on companies. That's why we believe that it's very important to keep updated on all these new regulations, and we are very happy to explore together with Focusright what the new EU regulation means for Swiss companies. And now, before I hand it over to Regula, I just would like to show you our housekeeping rules. Regula can change. Thank you. So we will record this webinar and we will share the slides after the webinar together with the recording. Please make sure that you are muted during the webinar and use the chat functions for questions and comments during the webinar. So please feel free to write all your thoughts, your questions during the webinar. We will maybe answer them already in the chat, or we will take them at the Q&A at the end of the session. And now, with no further ado, I hand it over to Regula, and I wish you all a very good webinar.
Thank you very much, Alice, for the introduction, and welcome also from our side to today's webinar. My name is Regula Meng. I'm a consultant at Focusright, and today I'm here with my colleague, Matthias Leisinger. For those of you who don't know Focusright, we are a specialized business and human rights consulting firm based in Zurich, Switzerland, and we help making human rights tangible for our customers from different industries. And maybe some of you have kind of followed the adoption of the CSDDD over the past months and years. It has been a long way to the final adoption in May, and it's great to finally have some more clarity now on what the new obligations, what they exactly entail, and more specifically, of course, what they will also mean for Swiss company. Just as a short disclaimer before we start, this webinar is really intended as a general summary of the law. We don't give legal advice or compliance advice. What we will give you today is kind of an overview of the directive, and we'll give you orientation of what are the most important aspects that you might want to look into more in detail for your company, and maybe also what kind of questions you want to discuss when you get legal advice, maybe from a lawyer or also from your in-house counsel. Before we go a bit further into the content, just to give you a bit of an overview of where do we currently stand with regards to the adoption and next steps that are taking place with the CSDDD. So today's webinar is based on the provisional text of the CSDDD that was published at the end of April. The directive is not yet in force, so there is not yet the final official text available, but this text is expected to be published very soon, and so we can have the final version of the directive very soon. So as Alice already mentioned, in May, the CSDDD was finally adopted by both the EU Council and the EU Parliament. The directive will enter into force soon. It will enter into force 20 days after it is published in the official journal of the EU, and this publication of the official journal is expected to occur in the coming days, possibly even tomorrow. So for those of you who are a little bit familiar with EU law, know that the directive is not directly applicable internally in EU member states, but it first needs to be transposed into national law. So we might expect some minor differences on how exactly each country then transposes the different requirements of the directive in the different EU member states. The EU Commission will also publish some guidelines to help companies conduct due diligence according to the CSDDD, so there is more details and more information is going to be published in the coming months and years. After the entry into force of the directive in July or August this year, the EU member states have 2 years to transpose the directive into national law. And after that, there will be a gradual phase in. So 1 year later, the rules will start to apply to the largest companies, with then a gradual phase in between 3, 4, and 5 years after the entry into force. This is just kind of to give you the overview in terms of timing, where we currently stand and what is going to happen in the coming years. We will cover today several aspects of the CSDDD. We start with going a bit more into detail into what companies and value chain elements are covered by the directive. We will also discuss what topics are covered by the CSDDD, what due diligence duties in terms of process-orientated requirements companies will have to implement to comply with the directive. And then, and this is of course a really big question, how does the CSDDD relate then to the Swiss legal obligations that maybe some companies that we have here in the call today are already implementing, and also to the future developments that we're expecting for Switzerland. And then to conclude, we will briefly have an outlook on how you can prepare for the CSDDD. So Matthias, could you tell us a little bit more about what the scope of application of the CSDDD is? So on the one hand, what companies are covered and what value chain elements or what section of the value chain does the CSDDD cover?
Thank you, and also welcome from my side. Yes, what we see, I mean, as Regula already outlined, there are 3 phases during which the CSDDD comes into or enters into force. So both that also applies for both companies in the EU and for companies outside the European Union, obviously also including companies from Switzerland. So as of 2027, non-EU companies with an annual turnover that is above 1.5 billion will be in scope. Then the following year, 2028, companies with more than 900 million turnover are in scope. And then as of 2029, companies with more than 450 million turnover are in scope. Important here to highlight is that for the non-EU companies compared to the EU companies, there are no employee thresholds applicable. When we look into the EU-based companies, so the same financial thresholds would apply, but here we also have employee thresholds. So as of 2029, then companies with an annual turnover above 450 million and more than 1,000 employees are in scope of the CSDDD. When we look into how many Swiss companies will be directly covered, I think there was a study published end of last year that looked into the thresholds that were originally raised by the EU legislator in a former draft. And this study concluded that somehow between 160 and 260 companies would be directly affected by the CSDDD. So now we can assume that it's certainly less than 150 companies, so only the very large ones that will be directly covered by the new obligations in the European Union.
And so, for example, if I'm not one of these roughly 150 or less companies that are directly in scope because of the thresholds that you just mentioned, does that mean that the CSDDD is basically not relevant for the company?
No, because then a lot of Swiss companies are indirectly affected. I mean, a lot of Swiss companies already would experience the indirect effects of, for example, the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. So because then legal developments abroad are relevant for the Swiss companies that are not directly in scope of the law. This is because then those obligations regarding risks in the value chains do not only affect the companies that is directly affected by law, but is also then indirectly affecting companies that are business partners of a company that is directly covered by the CSDDD. So the company that is in scope of the CSDDD is obliged to identify risks in its value chain and take measures to prevent or mitigate those negative impacts. That means that many companies in Switzerland are indirectly affected by the legislation. So the CSDDD explicitly requires that measures be taken with direct and indirect suppliers and business partners. So those due diligence requirements are thus passed on to the companies that are not directly affected by law. I think it's important to highlight also here that in the directive, there is also a statement that the companies that are directly covered by the directive should work together with their suppliers and business partner and also share costs for the implementation. How this will be implemented, the future will tell.
Can you tell us a bit more what type of suppliers or business partners can expect to be in this indirect scope of coverage through their business customers? So which business relationships exactly should be prepared to maybe answer more questions from their customers?
I think first of all, it is important that you do not forget the impacts of your own operations, including the subsidiaries. So those are also covered by the CSDDD. The starting point obviously is the own company, including subsidiaries. When we look more into the upstream value chain, I think the CSDDD does not only cover direct suppliers with which the company has a contract or commercial agreement, it also covers indirect business partners which perform business activities that are related to the operations, products, or services of the company. So for example, it includes also tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers that produce raw materials or product components that will then go into the company's final product and services. So the full upstream value chain is covered until the sourcing, extraction, and supply of raw materials that go into the company's products at the end. What is also kind of new compared, for example, to the German Supply Chain Act, that there is also a limited downstream value chain obligation. So the scope is limited to direct business partners where you would have a direct commercial agreement. So for example, in transportation and logistics, but also the downstream value chain is covered by the CSDDD. So Regula, I mean, when we talk about the topics, I mean, we not only talk about human rights, but also about environmental due diligence. So what are the topics that companies are need to cover when they work on the CSDDD? So for example, if my company is a supplier to a company directly in the scope of the CSDDD, what type of questions can I expect to them to ask me as a company based in Switzerland?
So basically, the CSDDD covers 3 thematic blocks, the whole block of human rights and then environmental topics and climate change. With regards to human rights, the CSDDD will introduce due diligence obligations, and with regards to climate change, there will be a requirement to adopt a climate change transition plan. And basically the objective of the activities or the due diligence obligations that the companies need to do in each of these thematic pillars are with regards to human rights to identify, prevent, and mitigate the potential negative impacts. So the risks that might be typical in the industry, in the value chain, that have potentially not yet materialized, but based on the information available, the company knows that the risks are there. And then, of course, once actual negative impacts on human rights are identified, then take measures to end, minimize, or remedy these actual adverse impacts. Then with regards to environment, the objectives are basically the same as with human rights. So it's also about identification, prevention, and mitigation of the potential negative impacts on the environment. And in case of actual negative impacts on the environment, the company has to end, minimize, and remedy the impacts that were identified. With regards to the climate change pillar, here the requirement is that the company needs to ensure that the business model or the business strategy is compatible with the objective of limiting the global warming to 1.5 degrees, so basically with the Paris Agreement. And what that means is that the company needs to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And now if we deep dive a little bit closer into each of these pillars, what is important to note is that with regards to human rights, is that it's really a quite broad thematic scope. So really the very broad scope of all relevant internationally recognized human rights are included in the scope of the CSDDD. In the annex of the directive in part 1, you can find the list of the International Human Rights Convention, of the UN Convention and ILO Labor Convention that are covered by the directive. We also made here a little summary, but basically I think what is different in the CSDDD compared to, for example, the child labor due diligence obligation that we currently have in Switzerland is that if you are in the scope of the CSDDD, you really need to consider human rights in a very broad sense, and including what we see here on the bottom left of the slide, including impacts that cause environmental degradation that will then have kind of as a secondary effect people's access to food, drinking water, and so on. So the human rights aspect also covers kind of the environmental aspects that have negative impact on people's livelihood. And other than that, we have lots of the topics that are currently relevant in the human rights due diligence conversation. So of course there is the right to life. There is the right to an adequate living wage, for example, the right children's rights, including the prohibition of child labor, the prohibition of forced or compulsory labor, and so on. So really in terms of human rights, it's very broad scope. In terms of the environmental topics that are covered by the CSDDD, you find them also in the annex in part 2. And here what we have is kind of 3 environmental clusters. The first one relates to everything that has to do with biodiversity and habitat protection. And for example, companies will be required to avoid or minimize negative impacts on biodiversity, natural heritage, properties and wetlands. And also there is a prohibition on the trade of endangered species without a permit. With regards to the cluster that relates to chemical and waste management, there are prohibitions, for example, on the use and treatment of mercury and mercury added products. There are prohibitions on the use of chemicals that are persistent organic pollutants. There are prohibitions with regards to the trade of certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides, with the trade or production and consumption of substances that deplete the ozone layer, and also with regards to hazardous waste. And as well here, the list of the relevant environmental convention is also contained in the annex if you want to have a closer look afterwards. And then finally, with regards to pollution prevention, there is a requirement that companies prevent the pollution from ships, and also that they prevent and control the pollution of the marine environment by dumping in general. And then finally, with regards to the climate change transition plan, there is an obligation for companies to adopt and implement such a transition plan for climate change that to ensure that the business model and the strategy are compatible on the one hand with the Paris Agreement, so with the transition to a sustainable economy and to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, and on the other hand as well to the EU objective of achieving climate neutrality, including the intermediate and 2050 climate neutrality targets. With regards to the contents of what exactly does such a climate transition plan need to cover, there are several elements that are listed. So, for example, there needs to be science-based climate targets both for 2030, kind of this would be the first target, and then in 5-year steps, targets up to 2050 to kind of answer the question, so how much does the company plan to reduce its emission and by when? There needs to be also information on the decarbonization measures and where the main emission reduction potential lies in the specific value chain or activities of the company, to answer the question of what are the key actions that the company can take to achieve the target, the science-based target that it has defined. As well, there needs to be some information about the financing of the measure. So how will they be financed? What type of investments and funding will support the implementation of the plan? And then finally, also information about the governance aspect of the implementation of the plan. So to answer the question of who will ensure that the targets are being met, that the actions are being implemented, and more specifically, what is the role of the different bodies of the company, the administrative bodies, the management, and the supervisory bodies with regards to the implementation of this plan. And I think here the good news is that for those of you who are already similar with the EU reporting requirements, so with the CSRD, is that the CSRD also has a requirement of implementing such a climate transition plan. And with regards to the adoption of the plan, the content of the plan, the requirements in the CSRD and the CSDDD are the same. So if a company is already doing or implementing a climate change transition plan based on the CSRD, there will basically be no additional requirements, because these two, I would say, these two contents are aligned. And so,
thank you, Regula. There was just one question in the chat as we are talking about the CSRD and CSDDD. Anne is asking, what are the differences to the CSRD regulation with regards to the CSDDD? Could you probably elaborate a little bit? I mean, we'll take this up later on when we also talk about reporting, but probably a few comments from your side.
So basically the difference is that in terms of the due diligence, that has several elements that you need to implement. And one element of due diligence is that you need to report about what you do. So there needs to be some level of some degree of transparency publicly available, where you tell the public and also internally your employees about what are you doing to ensure the sustainability of your business operations. And so basically the CSRD describes in a pretty high level of detail how exactly you need to report. And it complements the CSDDD in that the CSDDD describes, it doesn't give you so much indications about how to report, but it gives you indication of how to conduct due diligence. So I would say in that sense, they really go hand in hand, and they're also aligned insofar as the CSRD, so the Sustainability Reporting Directive, it's kind of the reporting element of the CSDDD. So they really complement each other.
Thank you. And I think what is also an important difference is that within the CSRD, you would also look into positive impacts when you do the impact materiality analysis with regards to environmental and social impacts. Within the CSRD, you would also assess positive impacts along the value chain, whereas with the CSDDD, you're mainly looking into negative human rights and environmental related impacts. That's another aspect. And then is the other question coming from Jenny, asking whether CSDDD is aligned with the OECD guidelines. I think we will come back to this in a minute. The short answer is mainly yes. So if you implement OECD, you not, I guess, 100% compliant with the CSDDD, but it's certainly a good starting point. And then Regula, there's a further questions. If you're just taking up a few questions out of the chat, it's more on the question of applicability. So if the company is headquartered in Switzerland and has subsidiaries in the EU, and the EU subsidiary would exceed the EU thresholds, would then the regulation also apply for the group companies considered?
Yeah. So from our understanding, if you have a subsidiary in the EU and the subsidiary kind of is over the threshold, then this really the due diligence obligations apply only to the subsidiary. But if it is the case that in parallel you still might have additional turnover that comes directly from the group, and this also is over the applicable thresholds, then it would apply to the group. But the obligations do not kind of skip from the subsidiary to the group if it's really just the subsidiary that is reaching the threshold.
Okay, thank you. There's a similar question coming from Lisa, which is asking, does the scope of due diligence obligations extend to non-EU based subsidiaries of the ultimate parent company? I think that goes into the similar direction.
Yeah. So basically, if the entity that is reaching or exceeding the turnover threshold in the EU, if that's the group company, then the obligations apply to the company as a whole. So it's not limited to, for example, certain products or services that you might sell in the EU market, but it's really a due diligence obligation that applies to the company level. So if the group company has or exceeds the thresholds in turnover in the EU, then it's the group company with the company as a whole that is then in scope of the due diligence obligations.
Thank you.
Excellent. So now, Matthias, we have heard a little bit about the scope and about the topics that the companies need to look at if they are touched in a direct or indirect way by the CSDDD. So what does it mean now to implement due diligence according to the CSDDD? What are the policies or processes that a company has to implement when it wants to do due diligence in line with the CSDDD?
Thank you. I think there are also a few questions on the due diligence requirements in the chat, and I think we can address most of them now during the next 10-15 minutes. So basically, the CSDDD requires large companies operating in the EU to conduct and monitor human rights and environmental due diligence across their operations, subsidiaries, and business partners. And this means that companies will need to identify, assess, and address any actual or potential risks along the value chain they have caused or contributed along the value chain, and make sure that they either as a company individually or jointly address those topics. And again, the scope of due diligence expands across the whole upstream value chain and partly also the downstream value chain, including own operation. And I think the good news is that, coming back to Jenny's question, the due diligence process outlined in the CSDDD is very much in line with international frameworks such as the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the UN guiding principles, and is very much also aligned with the key elements of due diligence that are outlined here. So in the following, we would like to show you a little bit in detail what it means when we talk about policy commitment, risk and impact assessment, taking risk-based measures, embedding governance, tracking, communicating, and grievance and remedy. So how actually the CSDDD relates to those core elements of human rights due diligence. Starting with a policy commitment. I think here the CSDDD asks company or expect from company to develop a due diligence policy. I think what is kind of interesting here is that also it asks for prior consultations with the company's employees and their representatives. So it's important to adopt a due diligence policies that ensure a risk-based due diligence. There are a few explanations on the content of the policy. So the policy should describe the company's approach to due diligence and make sure that also within the policy you describe the rules and principles to be followed throughout the companies and its subsidiaries, and also the company's direct or indirect business partners. So you should outline the expectations and rules and principles along the whole value chain. And thirdly, you should also describe the processes that are put in place to integrate the due diligence into the relevant policies and to implement due diligence. So basically a description of the management system when it comes to human rights and environmental due diligence. The update of the policy is required at least every 2 years, unless there are any significant changes. So for example, if you would acquire new business operations after M&A transaction, or if there's a large divestment, or you open a new facility or production site, which changes the risk landscape, that also might imply that you need to change the content of the policy commitment. Looking into the risk and impact assessment, I think, again, here companies are expected first to identify the general areas where the most severe and probable impacts are likely to happen before carrying out a more detailed assessment in those areas. So here the CSDDD differentiates between the so-called high-level assessment and then an in-depth assessment. The high-level assessment, in a high-level assessment, companies should identify and assess actual and potential adverse impacts arising from their own operations or their subsidiaries, and also very related to the chains of activities, and also including their business partners. So since the directive requires companies to assess the activities of their indirect business partners as well, it is important for companies to look beyond tier 1. So you are expected to expand the scope beyond tier 1, actually until, for example, raw material extraction, even though you might not have full traceability and a lot of information when it comes to the supply chain. But you can do such a high-level risk analysis also based on assumptions, based on publicly available information, without having full traceability. So that would mean that you would map out your value chain in order to identify general areas where those adverse impacts are most likely to occur and where are the most severe. So companies need to develop an understanding of both their upstream and downstream supply chains, also to be able to identify and assess the environmental and human rights impacts within the chains of activity. So I think there is a kind of a ongoing learning and gathering of information as you go along with the process. And based on this high-level assessment, you could also call it a salience assessment, then companies are asked to conduct in-depth assessments in the identified risk hotspot. So based on those results, their adverse impacts have been identified. It can be a country-specific in-depth risk analysis. It can be a raw material-specific assessment. It can be topic-specific risk assessments. So for example, one on forced labor, child labor, living wage, whatever. So then you are asked to conduct an in-depth risk analysis. And then based on this assessments, you prioritize the identified impacts based on, again, severity and likelihood as described in the OECD guidelines and also the UNGPs. But that's when we talk about risk and in-depth risk assessments or impact assessments. Then the next step is to look into measures. So you have identified your risks. Then you are asked also in the CSDDD to take appropriate measures to prevent or remediate actual and potential impacts. And I think here it's important that you adequately mitigate potential adverse impacts and bring actual impacts to an end through, for example, remediation. There's also a certain definition on what is appropriate, which would then depend on the company's connection to the impact. So those who are familiar with the terms cause, contribute, and link to. So that's basically how the appropriateness of measures is being described in the CSDDD, including also the leverage of an organization. And then you are asked to develop a preventive and corrective action plan to address those identified issues. Here, what is interesting also in this CSDDD is that there is the option to collaborate with multi-stakeholder initiatives. So there is more kind of importance, an increasing importance of so-called multi-stakeholder initiatives in order to jointly leverage or increase the leverage in the supply chain, where you can address potential risks in the supply chain with your peers. So here in Switzerland, a few examples. You have the Swiss Cocoa platform. This is mainly working in cocoa. There is similar initiative being launched in coffee. There is a Swiss Better Gold. So there are more and more of these multi-stakeholder initiatives coming up in order to address negative impacts in a value chain. There's also a statement about responsible exit. So just leaving a site or a country or an operation is just meant as last resort. So in cases where it's not, there's no reasonable expectation that the company's effort would succeed, so you are asked or expected to assess the negative impacts of suspending and terminating the business relationships. I think that's also quite interesting and something new in the CSDDD. Next, when we talk about integration and embedding, basically here companies are expected to integrate due diligence into all relevant policies and risk management systems within a company. So the integration into existing policies and systems is key. Here also we talk about different measures to address impacts. Those measures can include kind of contractual assurances from business partners that need to be accompanied by measures to verify compliance. So you can use third-party verification, for example. Modification of business plans is given as an example. Investments, adjustments, and upgrades of facilities. But there are a few examples outlined in the CSDDD of measures that are expected or could potentially be taken by companies. Again, here, what is explicitly mentioned is that there is the expectation to support business partners that are SMEs and also the collaboration with others to increase leverage. So the engagement with the business partners, direct and indirect business partners on the company's expectations, providing them access to capacity building, supporting them, providing them with guidance, even with financial support, is something that is outlined in the CSDDD. Then when we talk about the reporting element, I think that's something that has already been addressed. So if for those companies that are also in scope of the CSRD, they would report actually the elements of the CSDDD in the CSRD. So the reporting for CSDDD is done in line with CSRD. That's important when we talk about communication and transparency. Here, when we talk about tracking and communication, I think as in every management system, you should regularly assess the effectiveness and adequacy of measures based on relevant indicators. Again, here there is a time frame of an annual assessment, including also a transparent reporting and communication on issues that are covered by the directive, being it the specific topics that Regula just presented and or the management system that I'm just presenting now. So there needs to be a transparent communication to external stakeholders, that they can understand how you implement human rights and environmental due diligence within your operation. Then last but not least, the grievance mechanisms and access to remedy. Here, the CSDDD expects companies to establish a complaints procedure for persons who are affected or have reasonable grounds to believe that might be affected along, again, the whole supply chain. And I think that's certainly a challenging task. It's also expected that you establish kind of a notification mechanism for persons or organizations with informations regarding potential negative impacts. And when we talk about remedy, where companies have caused or jointly caused an adverse impact, the company shall provide remediation. The commitment to remediation can or should also be included, for example, in the company policy. So here, when you have been working with the OECD guidelines and the UNGPs, and you're familiar with the so-called effectiveness criteria of a grievance mechanism, I think then again, here you're well on track.
And Matthias, we always hear that stakeholder engagement and stakeholder consultations is a really important part of due diligence. Can you tell us a little bit more about the requirements with regards to stakeholder engagement?
Yes, I think that's quite interesting when you look into the CSDDD, that this so-called meaningful stakeholder engagement pops up at different stages. So the directive requires companies to engage actually with stakeholders throughout the due diligence process, be it from developing a policy, identifying and addressing impacts, through providing remediation, the monitoring, the ongoing process. So this also means that companies need to engage with stakeholders they're probably not used to engage with. Can be whistleblowers and NGOs and workers in the value chain, trade unions. So there are kind of a new communication with stakeholders coming up for companies that they might not be too familiar with. That also means that then there needs to be new communication approaches with existing stakeholders, but also with new stakeholders to be consulted. And given the importance also of meaningful engagement in the CSDDD, it is crucial for companies to ensure that their communication with different groups is, for example, interactive, that they are open for feedback, and companies must tailor the kind of the communication approach to the different groups based on their needs and their engagement level. So to make sure that the engagement is timely, is accessible, is appropriate, but also safe. So I think this element has been strengthened in the CSDDD, and the meaningful stakeholder engagement is certainly something that is new for many companies that have been working on due diligence and sustainability beforehand. So the scope of stakeholder engagement is expanding under the CSDDD. So Regula, those legal due diligence obligations are not necessarily new for Swiss companies. So coming back a little bit to Switzerland, and what does it mean for Swiss companies? So for example, as part of the counter proposal of the Swiss Responsible Business Initiative, Swiss companies are already implementing different sustainability reporting and due diligence requirements. So if you are a Swiss company and you already comply with the regulation in this regard, what else do they need to fulfill to the requirements of the CSDDD? Is there anything else they need to do?
Yes, so the short answer is it depends. What you already do. The longer answer is a little bit complicated. What we try to do here is kind of the map the different aspects of the due diligence and reporting requirements that are currently part of the Swiss Code of Obligations as a consequence of the RBI counter proposal. And we try to, this is really a rough mapping of what you're already doing as a company if you comply with the different elements, what the main gaps are, and what actions or further actions might be required to get ready to also implement the CSDDD. So basically, with the first element, if you are currently implementing the reporting obligations, sustainability reporting obligations of the Swiss Code of Obligation, it means that you are doing a sustainability reporting that is broadly aligned with the EU CSRD. And there are quite large differences between companies of how extensive, how transparent this reporting is. So here, the gap that you still have compared to implementing the full CSDDD is between, I would say, somewhere between quite a large and a medium gap. And this is due to the fact, as we heard before, is that the sustainability reporting obligation is only covering the reporting aspect of the CSDDD. That is potentially covered depending on how I would say how extensive the reporting is. But all the other elements of due diligence, what we heard about the policy, the risk assessment, the adoption and tracking of measures, the remedy, and so on, potentially this is not yet done. So all of this might still be required to prepare for the CSDDD. Then for companies who are in scope of the child labor due diligence, obligations and that decide to implement due diligence according to the steps that are defined in the Swiss ordinance. This means that they are conducting currently due diligence for child labor in the upstream value chain and in their own operations. And here again, the gap compared to implementing the CSDDD is still quite large because the CSDDD, as we saw before, covers a broader range of topics. It's human rights in general, it's climate change transition plan, it's environment, and also a larger scope of the value chain. So here, basically, you would still need to implement the full CSDDD. However, if the company is in scope of the child labor due diligence requirement and decided to comply with these requirements through the exception in the law and basically implement due diligence according to international standards, this means that the company is already doing a general human rights due diligence according to either the UNGPs or the OECD guidelines along the full value chain. And in that case, the company would be, roughly speaking, a bit better prepared. The gaps compared to the CSDDD might be somewhere between medium and small, depending on, again, how the company exactly interprets and what the ambition level of the company is, because there are quite large differences. However, what's important is that, for example, if you implement due diligence according to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, potentially the environmental aspects and the climate change transition plan is still missing and still needs to be done. And so basically here, what you would need to do is kind of check the detailed requirements of the CSDDD as a basis to then identify what you already have in place and then to close the potential gaps. And then finally, if a company is already doing the conflict minerals due diligence as defined in the Swiss Code of Obligations, the company is doing an upstream due diligence for certain minerals and metals from conflict affected areas. And here again, the gap compared to the CSDDD would be quite large, again, because the CSDDD covers a broader range of topics and materials and also a larger scope of the value chain, and you would still need to basically fully apply the different requirements of the CSDDD. And so then for Switzerland, what we expect in terms of legal developments in the future, because the one question that we have is to what extent can we expect that the Swiss law that is currently, as you can see, quite different from the requirements in the EU, the question of how will that potentially align with EU law in the future. What we have in terms of as a regulatory outlook is that in November last year, the Swiss Coalition for Responsible Business, they already announced that they will launch another popular initiative, so another responsible business initiative in Switzerland to introduce legal due diligence obligations for companies that are broadly aligned with the EU CSDDD. And they reconfirmed this in May now after the final adoption of the CSDDD by the EU. So here basically what we can expect is that public pressure and also pressure from civil society to align Swiss law with the CSDDD, this will certainly continue. And then on the other hand, we have currently in the Swiss Parliament an ongoing parliamentary initiative where they discussed a proposition to expand the scope of child labor due diligence that is already in place in Switzerland so that it also includes forced labor in the future, and this is something that is still under discussion. And then finally, what we have in terms of communications from the governments and maybe also plans or commitments from the government is that at the end of last year, they announced that once the CSDDD will be adopted by the EU, so basically starting now, the Federal Council will analyze more in depth how Swiss companies are affected by this directive and then decide on the next step to take in Switzerland. So from the Federal Council side, this question is still under analysis. And just recently, the Federal Council confirmed that they will, or the decision that they took to broadly align Swiss law on that it belongs to the realm of sustainable business with international developments. And they decided to lower the threshold for sustainability reporting in the Swiss Code of Obligations so that it will align with the updated EU requirements. So this is just to give you a broad outlook of what is expected to happen in Switzerland. And I think overall, we can expect that legal requirements in Switzerland will also continue to increase, even if it might still take a couple of years until we have alignment with EU regulations.
Thank you, Regula. So, I mean, seeing that the landscape is evolving and also in Switzerland. So for Swiss companies, I mean, knowing that, I mean, some of them might be directly affected, but a lot might be also indirectly affected. What would you suggest companies what they should do in order to prepare for the adoption of the CSDDD, whether they are directly or indirectly affected?
Yeah, here what we recommend is that you really look both at the process aspect and at the topic aspect of due diligence. So for example, when it comes to the human rights and environmental due diligence obligations, it's that you conducted gap analysis to identify which processes, which policies you already have in place. So what is your current status with regards to these process requirements and which are the main gaps compared to what's required by the CSDDD so that you can already start working on developing what you have and continue closing the gaps. With regards to the risk-based measures and really in general the measures that you're going to take to address an adverse impact on human rights and the environment, what we propose is you do a full mapping of the value chain. So really from the very start of the raw material extraction until the end of life processes. And you identify on the one hand the salient human rights issues along the value chain according to the requirements outlined in the CSDDD, but of course also the key environmental issues that you have along the value chain. And this will kind of give you the guidance of knowing where you need to focus your measures to address the potential and actual impacts. And then finally, with regards to the climate transition plan, as a start, the recommendation is to calculate the company's full CO2 equivalent footprint, so for scope 1, 2, and 3, and then define science-based emission reduction targets also in scope 1, 2, and 3 for 2030 that you have here kind of the basis to then implement the climate transition plan. And again, I would say the good news is that if you're already using international standards such as the UN Guiding Principles or the OECD guidelines as a basis for your due diligence, basically you're quite likely to have already a very good basis in place, and the gaps that you might need to close compared to what is expected under the CSDDD, they're rather small. And now we still have a couple of minutes for questions. I would assume there are a couple of questions in the chat that popped up in the last maybe half an hour that we were talking a lot, Matthias.
Yeah, I was already answering a few in the chat. Just try to find. Just let me check. There's one question on remediation, probably also can answer, Regula. Do you recommend to outsource the remediation, for example, in case of child labor, to work with a local NGO or center to support? Is it best practice to have an outside objective partner to advise on the remediations? Probably can explain a little bit how you would see this. That's the one with 2 likes.
Yeah. So basically, in terms of remediation, what is important is that the person who is affected can be reestablished as if, ideally, sometimes that's not possible, but ideally as if the negative impact never happened. So I think this, to really do that, from a human rights perspective, this needs really expertise in the topic. So for example, expertise in child labor, like you just mentioned, of how to do that, also making sure it's kind of a long-lasting solution and it's not just, for example, a one-off compensation and then you go away and then the child goes back into child labor. And I think it really is best practice to make sure you have the relevant expertise who helps you defining that. So it could definitely be somebody external. Some companies might have really topic-specific expertise also in-house, but if you don't have that, I think working with an external partner, with an NGO that really knows the local context, knows exactly how to deal with the issue that you identified, I think, as you mentioned, that is really good practice. And this will also contribute to finding the most impactful remedy that is really helping the person who was affected to remediate the impact.
Thank you. Then is also a question from Renata, who is asking how should they formalize and report that stakeholder engagement process has been established and that this has really happened in line with the requirements of the CSDDD. So how can you communicate about the stakeholder process along the whole due diligence process?
Yeah, I think on a general note, there are really good guidance on indicators that you can report on, and I think I will send that with you after the webinar in the email. So there is really good guidance available on what you should measure. But I think in general, what you can do is kind of explain a little bit what are the different processes that you have in place to engage with stakeholders. So, for example, do you have regular meetings in different countries? How do you invite people? What are the type of interactions? For example, is it a one-way communication where you just, for example, send out information, maybe a letter, or is it really that you invite them to a meeting where you can exchange? So just by describing a little bit more in detail which processes you have in place, which processes you implement, I think this would be really helpful along the whole due diligence cycle, and also thinking a little bit about who are the different groups of stakeholders that you engage with. So for example, you will certainly have different channels to engage with your own employees or workers in the value chain compared to how you engage with community members. And I think what's important when you're also thinking about the indicators according to like how can you measure maybe how many people to have reached, to always combine qualitative and quantitative indicators. Because for example, if you say we have made a mailing and we have reached, I'm just inventing 1,000 people, it doesn't tell you anything about the quality and the impact of this communication. So here, for example, it would be important if you do an event with a local community, let's just imagine that you have some kind of feedback loop where you can measure not only how many people attended, but also what was the perception of these stakeholders and how useful the engagement was. Were they able to express their concerns, Did they feel that it was a productive, useful, trustful space, and so on. So just when you report, think about both the quantitative and the qualitative aspect of stakeholder engagement. And in the sources that I will send you, you also find kind of some indications in this regard.
Thank you, Regula. I know there are a few more questions in the chat. Unfortunately, it's already 2:30, and I would like to hand back for a quick final word to Alice from our side. Thanks a lot for joining, for your interesting questions. We will learn more as we go along. I hope you found it useful. Thanks for joining. Please, Alice, for final closing. Alice?
You're still on mute, Alice.
I know. Okay. Sorry, I was not a co-host, so I could not unmute. Sorry. Thank you so much. That was extremely insightful. A lot of information within a really short time. Yeah, we see that we don't run out of questions, so I believe we will have some follow-ups to this event. Just for your information, we copied all the questions, so let's see if we can kind of make maybe a summary of the answers, so that and send that per email. Let's see. So I would like to thank you, especially Regula and Matthias, and also to all our attendees, and see you soon. Don't hesitate to write us an email if you have further questions, and we will be in touch again soon. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice afternoon.